Hello, my name is Gareth Mount, and I am a scout with the 5th Gary Oak Scout Troop in Victoria. Behind me is the Oak Bay Memorial Cenotaph, where I come every year for Remembrance Day. However, over the past couple years, I noticed that there are fewer and fewer veterans of the Second World War remaining, and that their stories are slowly being lost. So, when I was presented with the challenge of creating this community service project for my Chief Scout Award, I thought it would be a good idea to create a documentary of some of these veterans' stories to preserve them. The first man that I interviewed was a veteran named Peter Chance, and he was in the Royal Canadian Navy. Here are some of his stories. Hi, well, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Let me interview you.
It's my pleasure.
Alright. Can you tell me how you got involved with the Navy?
Oh yes, certainly. I grew up in Ottawa, and my next door neighbor, who was a young lad, older than I by a few years, he was already in the what was called the RCNBR Half Company, which was a group of us, about 100 all told, and with one officer was the gunnery officer by the name of Fred Sherwood, who subsequently was a very successful submariner in the Mediterranean during the war. And across the street from me was a man by the name of Commander Edson Sherwood, who, in his non-naval role, he was the comptroller at Rideau Hall, the Governor General's residence. So I had a good flavor, as it were, straight away. And so in the spring of 1939, I having previously joined the Reserve Division in Ottawa, and I went down to Halifax for my summer training in June and didn't come home because the war began in 1939, and a wonderful guy named Commander Teddy Ord said, "Hey, Peter, would you care to go to sea?" So I said, "Well, sure." So I found myself in a ship called Samaroff with my captain was the famous naval officer Harry DeWolf, who was subsequently the chief of the naval staff and the most highly decorated officer in the Royal Canadian Navy period. We had two brothers-in-law as lieutenants, and there was a young sub-lieutenant by the name of Patrick Nixon, and yours truly, the lowly one. I was the volunteer reserve midshipman on active list, a midshipman. $2 a day, $1 for the mess, or $15 a month for me. And so that was it. And it was good, but I was deathly ill for a while. I was so seasick, was always calling for Bill, but I'm glad to say I got over that. And then at the end of that year, my captain said to me, would I be interested in going permanent force? So I said, yes, sir, if I could pass the exam. So they sent me home to Ottawa. I was demobbed. I went to a crammer who tried to push spherical trig into me without much success. And then I passed the exam, went over with 14 other guys, naval types from across the country, and we joined what they call the Special Entry Group at the Naval College in Dartmouth, England, in southwest England. There were about 500 of what they call the Darts. They were the young would-be officers who joined the Navy at the age of 12 and a half and graduated when they were 18. We were special entries. There were about 85 of us, and we were there for just for one term, from September until December 1940. And then after that crash course, we were all sent to the fleet. And a guy named Benny Benoit from Quebec City and I, hell of a nice guy, we were great pals, we went to a ship called Mauritius. She was a colony-class cruiser in a place called Scapa Flow up at the top of England. in the Orkney Islands, and it was January, I remember so well, January 41, pitch black, and because we both had experience in operating small boats, we were put in charge of the ships, motorboats, which carried liberty men. Liberty men were people who were allowed to go ashore for a certain number of hours and go back on board. Well, as I say, that was January. Well, not terribly long thereafter, maybe a month or so, we were on our way. And there were about 850 people in that ship, and the two Canadians, Canada 1 and Canada 2. And off we went. We went to Gibraltar first, and then down to Freetown in Sierra Leone, where we went ashore. There's a place called Lumley Beach there, which it was hot. It's tropical. And so we kids had a great time. And don't forget, I was only 20 years old, 21, and having life was pretty good. So then off we went from West Africa down to the Cape, and stayed in Cape Town for a couple of weeks. And from there we went up to Durban and to Mombasa and to Aden, hotter than the hobs of hell in Aden. It's like a spot of desert. It's a little spot of the world that God forgot. Anyway, we then went from there to Colombo. We call it, it's called Sri Lanka nowadays, but it was called Ceylon when we were there. And we operated for 6 months out of Ceylon. And mostly it was kind of cruising around the Indian Ocean and escorting a couple of convoys, but mostly it was looking for the opposition, which we didn't find, I'm glad to say, to find. And then after that, we ended up in the Nicobar Islands, which are the west coast of Malaya, and then down to Singapore, where in December, early day, we arrived in Singapore in October. We went into the dry dock because we had to have our fire main repaired. A fire main is pipes all throughout the ship where water could be used for spraying on fires. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, so during that time, we two Canadian mids were sent by our commander with arrangements with the local authorities to learn a little bit about Malaya. And we were sent up to a place called Kuala Lumpur, and then to Penang, and over the top to a place called Kota Baru, which in English means new town. And there we stayed with a man who was a manager of a rubber plantation, of which there were many in that part of the world. And these plantations with the rubber trees, there are just rows of them. And they each have, like maple syrup trees, you have a little can, and the latex from the rubber tree drips into that can, which is then collected, and eventually they do something with it, and they make it into raw rubber. And that was all then sent back to the Dunlop Rubber Company in England for their necessary purposes throughout the war. Anyway, so we got back to Singapore, and then shortly thereafter, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales arrived, and the next day they were sunk. And so we had to get the hell out of there. And so in 72 hours, we were taken out of the dry dock, replenished with food, ammunition, you name it, and fuel, and off we went. And we raced back to Colombo, and then to Mombasa, where we picked up a troop convoy coming out of the desert with prisoners and people who had been wounded. And so we escorted that convoy of about 5 miners down to the Cape and round and back up to England. And so at that point, I left the ship. This was February 1942. From there, I was sent to another little ship, a much smaller ship. She was called, her name was Liddesdale, and about 1,000 tons. And we operated from the Thames estuary right up to Rosyth and through the Pentland Firth, which divides the top of Scotland with the Shetlands and the Orkneys, and down to a place called Oban on the west coast, and then back again, convoying these coastal vessels. And that had its moments, but nothing spectacular, except that one day in May, during the evening, we were told from Admiralty that there was going to be a lot of aircraft aloft. And sure enough, there was a total stream of aircraft going out that evening. And we were told that this was the first bomber raid from Britain against Germany of that war. That was May 42. And so we were also told that on the way back, we were to be advised that if any aircraft was below 5,000 feet, they were considered to be hostile, and we would open fire. Sure enough, the next morning it was foggy. We couldn't see a damn thing. But the radar operator said, "Sir, we've got a contact coming in on the surface pretty well, and he's now 15 miles coming in, and so don't forget we can't see him because of the fog. But as he came close and over us, well, first of all, we opened fire, and boom, 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 and the aircraft flew by. We could see, hell, it was one of ours. It was Wellington, which was a bomber, and he ditched. And later, the rear escort to the convoy picked these guys up, and they brought them to our ship, and boy, were they mad. They were Polish guys, and this is the first time that they'd been out to have a go at the opposition since their country was taken over by the Germans. Anyway, we filled them full of good stuff, and by the time we landed in Rosyth, they were happy, and no doubt, before very long, they were in the air again, attacking the opposition. Well, after that, I went to that period. I went to what they call sub-lieutenant's courses, which were to do with navigation, electricity, all various subjects that I had to take. And that lasted from September through to the end of the year. And so with that, then I was sent home. I had some leave in Ottawa. I went down to see my father, who was working in Washington. And then I was back to my next ship. It was a Canadian ship called Skeena. And in May 43. And I was in Skeena until the end of her end. And during that time, we did North Atlantic convoys, and then we were part of the invasion force on the 6th of June of 1944 for the invasion of Normandy. And then eventually we were reallocated to what was called the UK-Iceland Gap, which was a body of water between the northwest tip of Scotland and Iceland. And the object of the exercise was to patrol and to stop or help stop any egress of enemy ships coming out from the Baltic. Well, we did that, and then my ship was caught up in a fierce hurricane. And the result of which was that we were driven ashore and wrecked. And in Iceland. And we lost 15 of our guys, and they're still up there buried. It was demanding in the North Atlantic, in 43 especially, because the weather was foul. had 60-foot waves. And, you know, that's 60 feet is like a building height. And you go down, and then the bow would plunge into the next wave because of the wave length. And the next you get solid water over the top. And of course we were open bridges in those days. So it was, here comes the green one! And you get saturated. But anyway, we survived. And indeed, my ship Skeena could take anything at sea. But she dragged when we got into Iceland. And when she dragged, we found ourselves on the beach, and that was the end of the ship. That was in October 44.
Now, what do you mean when you say it dragged?
The anchor pulled, didn't hold. And so we had volcanic ash bottom. And it was like drawing a spoon through sugar. And we just went sailing along, and because we had snow squalls where you couldn't see anything anyhow. And your radar clutter was such out to 800 yards you couldn't see inside it with the kind of radar that we had in those days. So we landed up on the putty, and we were rescued, and it was flat calm the next day.
Wow.
The Icelanders rescued us. It was very traumatic. And the chief yeoman and I, he was named Wild Bill Kelly. As a secondary job, I was in charge of the ship's canteen. So we managed to get down into the flat where the safe was. There was water all over the place, of course. We got the damn thing open, and we got about 50 pounds worth of coins, which Bill Kelly carried in a sack, and I had a bag full of notes, about 3,000 pounds worth of English money. So anyway, we managed to get across a very sodden island called Vide, where we were picked up by a guy named Einar Sigurdsson, and he was an Icelandic fisherman, and he took us and saved us. He got us back ashore, and we were put into a depot ship called a Balder, and fed some rum, and we slept. We were exhausted. And the next day, of course, I cheered up quite a bit, and we got a lift in a ship called a Cinnabon, and the captain was a guy named Spike Hennessy, Ralph Hennessy, who was a friend. And it's amazing, you know, he was only 2 years older than I, but here he is in command. And I'm soldiering along, but I never got a command until I was in 1956. This was 43. So anyhow, as I say, we got a lift with Ralph in the Cinnabon back to Londonderry, which was our normal base. We would run from St. John's, Newfoundland, over to Londonderry, 14 days worth with convoys, and then we go back one going the other way. So anyway, with all this money, we thought, gee, we better go to the NAFI, because the NAFI was Navy Army Air Force Institute, known as the NAFI. And they were the ones to provide to the ships with all the stores. So I went in with Wild Bill, and I said, can we see the manager? So the manager came out. We're from Skeena. We know all about you. What do you mean? It's top secret. Nobody knows. Oh, yes, we do. Well, okay. We've got all this money. What are we supposed to do with it? We got to pay our bills. Oh, no, it's all insured. It's all yours. So I said, good God, we got all this pile of money. Anyway, we went back to the ship, or Cinnabon, where we were waiting our next move. And common sense prevailed, and the monies were all divided up and amongst the survivors, the families of the guys who were lost.
Mm.
And so that was the end of that. And in passing, I went back in '05 as a guest of Iceland, and they gave me a very generous reception. It was wonderful, because I'm the last of the Mohicans, as it were, of the people who were in that ship. So, as I say, 43 and 44, of course, was the D-Day operation. And then, as I say, we basically lost the ship up in Iceland. Well, when I came back from Korea, they said, right, my boy, you've had 40 days leave, now you can be the navigator of Ontario, our cruiser. So I then took her around South America and got home for Christmas, and in January, I guess it was March '53, off we went to the canal again and up to Halifax and picked up Quebec, our other cruiser, and an aircraft carrier, Magnificent, and off we went to England to take part in the Fleet Review, which took place on the 3rd of June. In passing, that Fleet Review comprised 7 lines of ships, 7 miles long, each ship divided, separated by 200 yards, one cable. So a huge number of ships, including Commonwealth, and we had the Russian cruiser, the Sverdlov, was there as well. So that was a highly exciting endeavor altogether, and Prince Philip and the Queen and the royal yacht came through the various lines, and we all did our thing, saluting and so on, cheering.
What, like, the living arrangements were like on the ships that you were on?
Oh, well, when I first went to sea, I slept in a hammock over an oil fuel tank. I was deathly ill. That was in '39 to the end of the year. In other ships, the cruisers were much larger ships, of course. You're looking at 10,000-ton ships. I had hammocks in that ship, and then later on, I had a cabin as I moved up the ladder a bit. But, not a problem, really. And a hammock was great because the ship would move around, but you sat there. You know, the hammock just, it was never moved. No, it was a very good ring, if you have to. When I was in the tropics, more often than not, we would take a mattress and put it up on the upper deck, and then sleep on that. Now we kept watches, you see, all the time. You were either on the morning watch, which was from 4 until 8, and then the forenoon watch was from 8 until noon, afternoon watch from 12 to 4, and then you had the dog watches, 4 to 6 and 6 to 8. And the whole idea was to ensure that there was a rotation, so that if you had the morning watch one day, you'd have the forenoon watch the next. And so that worked. And what can I say? It was very interesting. I enjoyed my life in the Navy. We had a great time in many ways.
Can you tell me what you did on during your spare time on the ships?
Well, I would sleep as best we could, 4 hours, and then I would have duties to do with the ship. I'd be in charge of the forecastle or in charge of the quarterdeck. But watchkeeping was the thing that I did. Normally there were 2 of us on watch at the same time. And 4 hours at a time. So you 4 hours on, 8 hours off. So you had to sleep, and then you had some daylight work.
Do you have any final comments or anything else you would like to share?
Well, I've been very lucky, and the French government inducted me into the Légion d'honneur as a chevalier, for which I have one of their gowns, and my health is pretty good, and I'm still here. Other than that, I keep active with the Naval Officers Association here in Victoria. I've been a past president, past president as well, and I'm also involved in as a volunteer at the hospital, and I also have other endeavors of a volunteer nature, but not. I'm not in business anymore. After all, I'm a bit older than you are, you know.
All right. Well,
Was that any good?
Yes. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, most of these are campaign medals, you see. And then your Defense of Britain ones, you've got the one at the end it's the Long Service Medal.
Oh, yes.
Canadian Long Service Medal, 32 years. With Queen's Golden Jubilee. And the other ones are Korea. And then Defense of Britain, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, Indian Ocean.
The second gentleman that I interviewed is named Miggs Turner. He was also part of the Royal Canadian Navy and had some fascinating stories. Here they are. Well, thank you for allowing me to interview you, Mr.
Thank you
Turner.
for inviting me.
Alright, so, can you tell me how you got involved with the Navy?
Well, originally, I was supposed to be in the Army, and when my father got transferred east, we were living in Victoria. He went east. My brother was finishing high school in Esquimalt, and I was at school here. It was Michael's Boys' School at that time. Mum stayed out here till we finished the school year until the June 1940, and then we went east to join Dad. And my brother at that point was in the Reserve Army out here, and he transferred to the Reserve Army in Toronto. I joined the Reserve Army, 7th Toronto Field Regiment, and they were preparing to go overseas. At that time I was 16 years old, so I was a bit young. My brother, when they finished with that summer, we spent the summer at Camp Niagara training in the Reserve Army. And come September, my brother went to the last class at Royal Military College, trained cadets, officers. And I went to school, to a boys' school in Toronto. And but I stayed on in the Reserve Army. We trained 2 nights a week and weekends. And after the second year, the 7th Toronto Field Regiment, the 25th Battery, which was the battery I was in, called up and went overseas. I was still too young, 17. They wouldn't take me. So they promoted us from gunners to Lance Bombardiers. And then I was scheduled to go over as a Lance Bombardier the following year when I had written my matriculation. Went back to school in 42, 43. Then come spring of 43, getting ready to write matriculation. At that point I was also in Sea Cadets. And I heard in Sea Cadets that the Navy made an arrangement with the Department of Education that if you joined the Navy, you didn't have to write your matriculation exams. So I thought that was a great arrangement. So I decided to join the Navy, and I went down and asked the orderly room on the Avenue Road in Toronto, do we have this arrangement? And they said no. So then 6 of us promptly went down to the Navy recruiting office and joined up. And 2 weeks later, we were ordinary seamen in the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. And we went off to do our training in a place called Cornwallis, which was in Nova Scotia near Digby. There was turning out 2 new ships in the shipyards every week, and they were so short of everybody in the crew that they'd made this arrangement with the Department of Education in Ontario that you didn't have to write your exams, so to make up the crew. When we graduated, let me go on a little bit about the same story.
Yes.
The last week was interesting. The last week I was at Cornwallis. While we were there, the training was excellent. There were 60 in a class, and there were 3 new classes every week training. The place was being built new. There were piles of sand everywhere. And when someone did something wrong, the instructors would double us over these piles of sand, double us back and forth as punishment. And then when we'd finish, we were given shovels to pile the sand back up again for the builders so the contractor could carry on. And that was good fun. Anyway, on one occasion, we got on very well, the 60-odd in our class. Young ordinary seamen got on extremely well. But one squealed on another one of our friends, one of our class, on one occasion. So after, in the evening, there'd be an officer making rounds about 9 o'clock every night, just to make sure everybody was in their bunks and in their hammocks and turned in. And after he'd gone by, we then got this one guy and whistled him. He was in his hammock. We wrapped him up in his hammock and hoisted him to the top of a telephone pole, and then left him there. And he was there till about 1 o'clock when eventually someone spotted him up there and went and got him and brought him down. And needless to say, the 60 of us were out doubling around over sand piles again. And it was good fun, but that was the way it was. When we were going, the last week was to be spent at sea in a four-stacker, an old U.S. Navy four-stacker destroyer, which they were using as a training ship, and HMCS Hamilton. I can show you a picture, it'll come up here eventually. Before we were going to sea, one of our classmates said, "Eat lots of raisins and you won't be seasick." So we all went to the canteen and bought lots of raisins and just plugged ourselves full of raisins. Then we joined the ship, and then my classmate said, "Turner does not like heights. Give him a watch up on the crow's nest. That's up the mast, high up." So my first watch was in the crow's nest. So when we sailed, went to my first watch. This was, we were sailing in the Bay of Fundy. I climbed up the mast, climbed into the crow's nest. The chap that was there ahead of me had to stand up on top of the crow's nest, holding on to the mast, when I climbed in up to the bottom trapdoor. Then we changed places. Then he told me what was around. There were no U-boats around or anything, but there was a ferry going across to New Brunswick. Other than that, nothing in the area. Then he took off, and I stayed in the bridge while the ship was doing this in the Bay of Fundy. And I could feel myself about to upchuck, and I did not want to upchuck in the crow's nest. So I leant over the side and upchucked, and not realizing that the the bridge of the ship, the destroyer, was wide open directly below me. And so they described it as buckshot when the raisins came down. And so that they didn't leave me in the crow's nest very long. They moved me rather quickly at that point because I was being seasick. But that was my first time there. Then we finished our course. Everybody graduated, and they said, "Okay, well now, anybody with matriculation or above, we'll make you an officer. We'll give you a 3-week course." They were so short of crew with these 2 new ships every week coming into the Navy from the shipyards across Canada. We'll give you a 3-week course, and those who pass will then send on for more serious training. So we went off and did our 3-week course, and everybody passed. It was a good course. The last week, the course was spent in a ship called Renard, which was the fastest ship in the Canadian Navy at that point, 47 knots. It had been a luxury vessel for a millionaire down in New York who turned it over to the Navy at the beginning of the war. And it had been his yacht. And it was a very fast ship, very slim, but it was good. But anyway, we joined the ship. It was being used. It had a gun now on the forecastle, and it was being used for escort duties off the east coast of Halifax. And so we go out to sea and do our duties, then come in. And on Christmas Eve, we came in. The last week we were in the ship, we came in for the first time, and of course we were all feeling very blue, homesick as could be. And one of my classmates went ashore and did some Christmas shopping. This was Christmas Eve. Went ashore, came back. In those days, you had records which you put on a record player. Well, he came back with a record which he just bought. And in the mess deck where we were, we had a record player there. She went over and put the record on the record player, and it started to play. And the next thing, within a few seconds, 2 of my other classmates went over, grabbed the record off the turntable, smashed it on the table it was on, opened a scuttle, and threw it out the porthole into the ocean. It was Bing Crosby singing "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The first year it came out, 1943, and needless to say, it was not a good one. We were all feeling so very homesick. We weren't going to be home for Christmas. Anyway, then we all graduated. They took everybody as an officer. Went off and did our training. And then I did my training at King's College, which was the Naval College in Dalhousie University in Halifax. And we had 3 months there. And when we finished, we were then said, "Where would you like to go?" Then we were told what ships and so on were available. And by this time, I had decided that I was going to stay on in the Navy permanently. So I would like to go to a destroyer and with some permanent force officers, so where I could learn to be, to be a permanent force officer. At this point, I was a sub-lieutenant, RCNVR, Volunteer Reserve, and they said, "Well, we don't have any spots available, but we have one ship, HMCS Guelph, corvette, which had just been commissioned, and the captain of that ship has just turned permanent force. He was Merchant Navy, and he's 23 years old, but very smart. We'll send you to his ship." So I said, "That's great." And so I then went over to, it was on the mid-ocean escort run, running between Newfoundland and London. Well, Londonderry was our base in the UK. It was running back and forth, escorting convoys. At that time, the ships, there were about 100 merchant ships in each convoy. the convoys had to keep England supplied, or the UK, United Kingdom supplied with supplies, both not only for the military, but also for the residents there. And so the ships were just laden down, and every 3 or 4 days there'd be 100-ship convoy crossing the Atlantic. You can see some of the ships in the background there. And so we would take the ship across. So I went over to to Newfoundland, which was the base for the group that I was in. C8 group was the group that HMCS Guelph was in. And the ship, I just missed her. She just sailed on the convoy. So for a month I was on duty at nighttime, patrolling the guards, port security guard officer. Every second night I was on duty, checking to make sure the guards were all awake. There were oil tanks and all sorts of things there where they expected the Germans could come in and blow up. And they didn't want any spies or things like that. Anyway, eventually the ship came in. I joined the ship at the end of 1944 and sailed. And she was a great, Skinny Hayes, Captain Godfrey Hayes, Lieutenant Commander, was the captain, and he was a lieutenant at that time. He was the captain, and I just learned so much from him. And I got my watchkeeping certificate with him, where you stood on the bridge by yourself. When the captain wasn't on the bridge, you were in command of the ship. And that was great, and it was very good training. On one occasion, though, it was dusk, and I was about to go on what's called a dog watch. From 6 to 8 is a dog watch, and I was about to go on the dog watch as the officer of the watch. And I was 19, I guess, at this point. And we suddenly got I was having supper and suddenly got a call, man overboard. So I stopped having supper, and those who were having supper went up top to the deck and discovered that one of the ships in the convoy had spotted a small light astern of Guelph. This was at dusk, and had reported it to the escort commander. And the escort, there were 6 ships escorting a convoy, around 100 ships. The escort commander was at the leading edge, and then we were off on the starboard side, on one of the ships escorting. And it was reported that one of the merchant ships had spotted this light, small light astern of Guelph. And so it was reported, and the ship officer of the watch at the time called back to the after lookout, standing in the back there, and to see, could you see the light? Didn't get an answer. So they sent someone back, and they realized that in the heavy weather he'd been thrown over the side. And as he'd gone, he grabbed anything he could, and as he went by, we called them Cowley floats then. You call them Zodiac today, from your Coast Guard days, but it was a Cowley float. There were lights hanging upside down with C-cell batteries in them, and when they hit the water, they turned upright, and the light came on. Well, this was the light that they had seen, and so we then saw the light. The captain was now on the bridge. He took over and brought the ship up to about 15 feet from the light, and there we could see our after lookout going up and down in the water, disappearing, then coming back up. And then suddenly we saw him go down, and he didn't come back up again. And as I was saying, we were told as officers, young officers, always take care of your men. So I got out of my life jacket, out of my duffel coat, and jumped in the water. And right over the top of where I'd last seen him, reached down and managed to grab his duffel coat hood, pulled him up, and by this time he'd passed out. So I put him between my legs, held on to him between my legs, and they threw us life jackets, but the wind blew them away. after 12 or 13 life jackets thrown at us. So then they threw us a line, like the line on the wall there, and I grabbed it, and they pulled us over to the side of the ship, then tried to pull us up. They put a couple of knots in the line so I could hold it, but I still, it was too heavy, still slipped up and down. And after about 15 minutes, as the ship rolled back and forth, it would go out and be dumped in the water. Next thing we'd be back as the ship rolled the other way, be banged against the ship's side. And this is where I hurt my hips. So then, eventually, they dropped the Carly float, brought it up to us, and we got the other chap on board, the chap who passed out, onto the Carly float. Then I climbed on board. Then they moved it back to the lower part of the deck there, where we got him on board. And then as I stepped on board, I passed out. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the officer's bathtub with the captain pouring overproof black rum down my throat to sort of bring me up. That was the thought in those days, and to bring me back to life, which it did. And I've been drinking black rum ever since. I was a teetotaler at that point. I was out of action initially, but then they were short officers of the watch, and I realized that the captain was standing a watch, taking one of my watches. And so I said, I'm fine, and let's put me back to work. So I went back to work, and the captain gave me permission. That there's a seat on the bridge, which is known as the captain's seat. And the captain only is allowed to sit in the seat. Well, we knew at night time the captain was sleeping down below. So when we were officers of the watch, we would steal in and sit on his seat. But this time the captain said, when you're on watch, you don't need to be moving around. Knowing I was recovering, sit on the captain's seat. So this I did. When we commissioned, before I joined, this Cocker Spaniel called Rags. And he was the ship's mascot. He lived in the captain's cabin, and when he needed to poop or anything, there was a place behind the funnel. We'd take him up and he'd do his job there. And we had a picture of him one occasion in the wardroom, which was the officers' mess in the ship. We had a picture of Skinny Hayes, our captain, with a Coke bottle, holding it with the Rags up on his heels, holding the Coke bottle between his paws and drinking it. And so when we had to have a ship's crest, they took the Coke bottle out and put a German U-boat in there. So he's now holding the German, Rags is now holding the German U-boat between his hands. So that became the ship's crest, which was painted on the side of it doesn't show in the picture there, but eventually they painted them on the side of the forward gun. But that's how we got our ship's crest for HMCS Guelph. The last time we sailed from Londonderry to bring a convoy over, we were bringing we sailed from Londonderry to pick up our convoy in the Irish Sea, and 100 ships on, and they're mainly empty ships, bringing them back. That was the cruiser I was in, the Ontario, and we brought them back. We'd gone out to pick up this convoy, and then the escort commander received a message to send one of his ships down to Portsmouth in southern England on the English Channel to report to the Commander-in-Chief submarines. Didn't know what it was all about, but he selected Guelph, knowing that Skinny Hayes knew the English Channel very well, being in the Merchant Navy before. So Guelph was told to go down. So we went down, got to Liverpool, and we didn't have any charts for the English Channel, and there were minefields all over the place. So we went into port. They wouldn't allow us in because we weren't expected. We told them we were coming down for charts, and so they sent out a chart. A boat came out, a Wren's boat crew brought out a bunch of charts for us of the English Channel, which we then got, and then we went on down to Portsmouth, where the captain reported to the Commander-in-Chief submarines. We were told that we were going to have to escort an Allied submarine across the Atlantic to Philadelphia for ship repair. The submarines were all the shipyards were all too busy in England to repair it, so they'd made arrangements for the Yanks to do the repairs. And so this is the arrangement that we had, and to bring the submarine across. Well, bringing a submarine across the Atlantic, everybody would think it was a German submarine, and the first thing they'd do is come in and bomb it or blow it up. So every day the Admiralty would put out a message to say where we were and where we expected to be in the next 24 hours. So you weren't allowed to attack a submarine on the surface. And we then escorted the submarine with a very badly damaged bow across.
Oh.
And we crossed the Atlantic. Fortunately, we had no trouble until we got off the U.S., the east coast of the U.S. And the U.S. Navy had dirigibles, blimps as we called them, out there when they were doing coastal patrol. And suddenly, one morning, we saw this blimp coming in on us. The message had gone out to everybody. It was this Allied submarine on the surface heading for Philadelphia. But this blimp had come out and was doing a run-in on the submarine. So Skinny Hayes came to the bridge and brought the ship, told the submarine was called Sea Rover, and told the captain of the Sea Rover to steer a steady course, and then he brought Guelph right up alongside it, just a few feet off, steering the same course, so that if the blimp came in to bomb the submarine, you would see it was also bombing this Allied corvette, the ship. So the submarine came right in and came right down, and looked there just as very ready to drop bombs on us. And then suddenly it twigged and got the message. We were flashing with the light the whole time, trying to tell them that this was an Allied, a British submarine. And eventually got the message. That was the closest we had. And then we carried on, got into Philadelphia, and in the harbor, we delivered the submarine to the shipyard, and then we came back to up to Halifax for a boiler clean, and then every 6 months corvettes needed what they call boiler cleans, so we had a boiler clean for a couple of days in Halifax, and then going back to join the rest of the escort group in Newfoundland for another convoy across. And we got the word that VE Day had arrived. That's Victory in Europe Day. That was the end of the war with the Germans. After the end of the war, most of the U-boats were mainly on shore, because during the war and the convoys going back and forth initially, these U-boats were very successful in the middle of the Atlantic, where there was no air coverage, and so they could come up to the surface and be on the surface a lot. Toward the end of the war, there was air coverage from Iceland, and so the submarines then moved mainly to the coastline. And there were still some out there, but mainly they were on the coastline, and we would look for them up and down the coast. So then we got ready for the Pacific War. We were at that time we were asked if we wanted to go to the Pacific War and fight the Japanese, we had to volunteer. So most of us volunteered. We were given 30 days leave to go home. We went home for 30 days leave, and then we joined ships to go to fight the Pacific War in the Pacific. And by that time, the Yanks fired their second atomic bomb, and that made the Japanese stop. So on Japanese leave, that picture on the left there on the wall, it shows my brother. I was on leave with my mum and dad in Toronto, and I was on leave as a young sub-lieutenant, and my brother, who was fighting the war in France, came back on his Japanese leave. So my dad and my mum and my grandmother, we went down to the exhibition grounds in Toronto to meet my brother getting off the troop train, bringing the troops back from Germany. So that was the picture taken at that point. And but we never. By the time I'd finished my 30 days leave, the Japanese had surrendered. So then I stayed on in the Navy, and I then, after the war, had to specialize in something. So I took a one-year course in communications and electronics, and then I was scheduled to go. You saw the picture of the cruiser Ontario out here. So I came out to Ontario to be the signal officer in the ship. I was lieutenant by this time. And I arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. And when I arrived, I was told that the owners of the Oak Bay Beach Hotel were having a Christmas party on the 27th of December at their home, which is right next door to the hotel. And they were looking for bachelors to come to the party. So I would like to go, and I left with my friend, and I said, sure. He said, you got to wear a uniform, gold stripe down your pant leg and everything, as a young lieutenant in the Navy, a permanent force at this point. And so we went. I arrived at the house, and lo and behold, I walked in, and in one of the bedrooms, I discovered Diana. I'd never met her before, in one of the bedrooms with another friend of mine. The bedroom was a cloakroom, so it was okay. and so I met Diana for the first time, and that's how we met, and 6 months later we were married. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah. Can you tell me what sort of like training you received?
Well, we had the initial 8 weeks training as ordinary seamen at Cornwallis, as I mentioned, and there were 60 of us in a class, and three classes a week coming in at that point. Cornwallis, very good training, and when we did something wrong, as I said, we were doubled around, but we learned how to fire rifles and fire guns and various other things.
Could you tell me what your living arrangements were like when you were actually at sea on the boats?
We were in hammocks, except in the U.S. Destroyer where they had bunks, but other than that, we were in hammocks where you wrapped up your hammock every morning and stowed it away because you used the space for meals and so on in the mess decks. But otherwise you slept in a hammock, which was good fun because while we were in the training, living in a hammock, if one of our classmates did something we didn't like, we'd go down to Bay of Fundy, get hold of a couple of lobsters, bring them up, and put them in the hammock with our friend who was resting in the hammock. But the hammocks were very good. And at sea, as the ship swayed back and forth, the hammock swayed too. Whereas in the bunk, you then had to hold on or you might get thrown out on deck.
Okay. Speaking of like the mess deck, what did you eat on the boats?
Meals were on the whole very good. They, you had in the mess deck, someone from the mess deck would go back to the galley and pick up food, bring them back. There were about 30 in a mess deck. They'd bring back about 30 meals to the tables were underneath your hammocks, which were down by daytime. But you sat at nighttime when some people were sleeping, or even during the day, some people were catching up on rest. The hammocks were above you, and you sat at tables, and the meals were brought to the galley. And some of the destroyers and so on, they actually had a galley area where you could go and pick up your meal and sit in the galley area in the mess deck, clear of your bunks and things.
Okay, did you ever have any sort of spare time on the ships?
Not very much. I used to write home frequently, and when we had an opportunity, the mail would go ashore. But on the whole, there wasn't much spare time. We were kept busy, up at 6 and to bed at about 9 o'clock at night. And you were, of course, on watch during the night. The watches were from midnight to 4 o'clock, 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock, 8 till 12, noon until 4 in the afternoon. And then you went into the dog watches, first dog from 4 to 6, the second from 6 to 8 o'clock, and then the last watch was 8 o'clock until midnight. And so there wasn't much spare time.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Well, I'm afraid we've taken a lot of your time.
Mr. Turner?
Miggs is the name. You shake with left hands.
Yes, it's the scout handshake. Thank you very much.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, good luck with you, and I hope things go well for you.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope that you have enjoyed listening to these two gentlemen's stories as much as I did when I interviewed them. I think that it is important for us never to forget the sacrifices that these veterans made during these conflicts. Thank you very much.